There is a version of Prince Harry's post-royal life that is genuinely compelling, and telling that version honestly matters before examining anything else, because this story has been load-bearing. It has done serious work building something real, and that is precisely what makes the next section count. Harry departed the royal family in early 2020, and the public explanation, delivered across a series of interviews, a memoir, and a documentary series, stayed consistent in its core argument. He could not remain inside an institution he believed was structurally indifferent to the suffering of vulnerable people, including, he said, his own wife, a family that prioritized protocol over humanity. Press ecosystem he held responsible for his mother's death and believed was now targeting Meghan. His departure, as he framed it, was not a retreat from responsibility but a redirection of it. The post-royal identity Harry built rested on specific, named commitments. Mental health advocacy through the Archewell Foundation, veteran support through the Invictus Games, which he founded in 2014, and which has grown into a genuinely significant international event, and conservation, specifically the protection of African wildlife, and the ecosystems that sustain both animals and the human communities living alongside them. African Parks sat at the center of that conservation identity. Harry joined its board in 2021, and African Parks is a nonprofit that manages national parks across the African continent under partnership agreements with host governments, operating in 14 countries and deploying hundreds of millions of dollars. It presents itself, and is presented by its supporters, as a model of effective conservation, private management expertise applied to protecting biodiversity hotspots that cash-strapped African governments cannot adequately fund on their own. His advocacy for African parks was never quiet. Interviews followed, events followed, and the platform Harry had constructed by 2021, one of the most globally visible platforms any private individual had ever held, was directed toward positioning African parks as exactly the kind of institution his post-royal identity demanded. Conservation that serves both wildlife and the communities living near it, science-backed, rights-aware, the antithesis of the colonial trophy hunting model. Africa, by his own account, carries a spiritual weight for him. He proposed to Meghan there, and across interview after interview, his words about the continent carry a consistency of feeling that reads as genuine. When Harry says Africa matters to him, nothing in the record gives particular reason to doubt it. That is the story as he tells it, and here is the question that sits at the end of it without a good answer. If Harry's African conservation work is genuinely grounded in a commitment to the people who live in and around those ecosystems, including the indigenous communities whose ancestral relationship to that land predates the national parks themselves by thousands of years, then what exactly was he doing in Scottsdale, Arizona in the last week of May 2026, raising $1 billion for the organization whose rangers an independent law firm found to have beaten, tortured, and raped those people? The documented record is the only place to start. The Baka people are an indigenous community of the Republic of Congo whose ancestral forest was absorbed into Odzilla-Kokoa National Park, a park currently managed by African Parks under a partnership agreement with the Congolese government. The Baka did not negotiate that absorption. Their access to land they had lived on for generations was restricted, and then, according to an investigation conducted by Omnia Strategy, the law firm founded by Cherie Blair, the rangers responsible for enforcing those restrictions committed acts of serious physical violence against members of the Baka community. Credible evidence of beatings, torture, and rape. Those are the findings. African Parks Apps acknowledged them in a statement issued in May 2025, confirming that abuses had occurred and committing to reforms, and that acknowledgement stands in the organization's own public record, uncontested. Survival International is a London-based nonprofit that has campaigned for the rights of indigenous peoples for more than 50 years, carrying a sustained record of documentation on exactly this category of abuse: the displacement and mistreatment of indigenous communities by conservation organizations operating alongside state security forces. Survival International is not a fringe group. It holds standing in the global human rights conversation. In May 2023, Survival International wrote directly to Prince Harry, publicly. The basis of the letter was explicit. Harry had positioned himself as a campaigner for racial justice and for the rights of marginalized communities, and Survival International cited that positioning as the reason they were writing to him specifically, not to a random board member, but to a man who had built a public identity on exactly the values they believed his board membership was violating. They asked him to resign. Harry did not resign. On May 27, 2026, Survival International published a renewed formal call for his resignation, noting that despite African Parks 2025 acknowledgement of abuse and its commitments to reform, the the problems on the ground had not been resolved. The Baka were still being subjected to abuse, the Rangers were still operating, and the structural conditions that produced the violence had not been dismantled. May 27 and 28 TT20. The same days Survival International published that renewed call. Harry spent in Scottsdale, Arizona, attending a fundraising event for African parks with the stated goal of raising $1 billion. What the documented record shows is a formal resignation demand, published by a credentialed human rights organization, citing ongoing abuse of indigenous people by rangers paid and managed by African parks, published within days of Harry publicly fundraising for that same organization. That is not a smear campaign, that is a document. Before going further, if you are watching this because you want royal commentary that reads the actual documents, names the actual organizations, and checks the actual timelines rather than repeating palace sources or tabloid angles, subscribe now and hit the bell. This channel does not traffic in rumor, and the documented record on this story is extraordinary. The issue is not a single event in Scottsdale. The issue is a pattern, and that pattern matters because it speaks directly to whether the gap between Harry's stated values and his documented behavior is a one-off oversight or a structural feature of how his post-royal identity has been constructed. Trace the timeline. Harry joined the board of African parks in 2021, and at that point, concerns about conservation organizations and indigenous rights in Central Africa were not new. Survival International had spent years documenting abuses by eco-guards operating in African national parks before Harry took his board seat. The WF, operating a separate set of parks, had faced similar documented allegations. The broader critique of what some scholars call fortress conservation, the model in which wildlife is protected by excluding the human communities who have historically lived alongside it, was a well-established debate in the conservation literature by 2021, and a board member conducting due diligence would have encountered it. Harry's public appearances on behalf of African parks escalated through 2022 and 2023, with each appearance adding to the load that the humanitarian credential was being asked to carry, each interview in which he described his African conservation work as values-driven and community-focused, increasing the gap that would become visible when the contrary evidence surfaced. And that's when Survival International wrote to him directly in May 2023. That moment is where the escalation pattern becomes impossible to explain by reference to ignorance. Before May 2023, charitable reading could hold that Harry was relying on African Park's own characterization of its work and had not been directly confronted with the counter-evidence. After May 2023, that reading closed. He had been written to, given the specific allegation, and asked by name, citing his own stated values, to resign. The next data point arrived in 2025, when African Parks issued its own acknowledgement that abuses had occurred. The organization's internal investigation, conducted by Omnia Strategy, had confirmed what Survival International had been alleging, and the acknowledgement was public. Harry remained on the board. Then, in the last week of May 2026, he flew to Arizona to help raise $1 billion. Each step of this timeline raises the stakes of the credibility claim. Joining the board could be read as an imperfect but genuine attempt to engage with conservation. Continuing after the May 2023 letter is harder to read that way. Continuing after African Parks' own 2025 acknowledgement is harder still. And attending an Arizona fundraiser in the same week as Survival International's renewed formal demand, against the backdrop of the organization's own admission of abuse, is not an oversight. That is a choice. You do not accidentally attend a billion-dollar fundraiser for an organization whose rangers your own prior board documents confirm committed rape and torture of indigenous Africans, 2 days after a formal public demand for your resignation. That is a decision. Harry's board position at African Parks is not a ceremonial role, and the legal dimension of this story is not being discussed clearly in the mainstream coverage. Under U.S. nonprofit governance law, board members carry fiduciary duties. 3 of them sit at the core: the duty of care, the duty of loyalty, and the duty of obedience. The duty of care requires a board member to exercise reasonable diligence in overseeing the organization's activities, while the duty of obedience requires the board member to ensure the organization adheres to its stated mission and to legal and ethical standards. African Parks conducts operations in multiple African countries and receives funding from US-based donors and institutions, including through its US fundraising operations. And that cross-border structure, combined with board member participation in US-based fundraising events, creates a nexus between the board member and US regulatory frameworks that does not exist for purely overseas roles. The question a nonprofit governance attorney would ask is direct. At what point does a board member's continued participation in fundraising activities After documented evidence of serious human rights violations by the organization's managed rangers has been acknowledged by the organization itself, create a breach of fiduciary duty. African Park's 2025 statement acknowledged that abuses occurred. The Survival International's May 2026 statement specified that the problems had not been resolved. A board member who continued fundraising after both of those data points was not acting without information because the information was public. The organization had published it. And this is where it gets structurally complicated. If Harry's legal representatives were asked to defend his continued board membership after May 2025, the available defense would likely center on the claim that African Parks had acknowledged the problem and committed to reform, and that continued board participation itself drove that reform from within. That defense might hold narrowly as a matter of nonprofit governance. But the problem is what that defense does to the broader claim. If Harry's role after the 2025 acknowledgement was to drive reform from within, then the Arizona fundraiser in May 2026, raising $1 billion while Survival International is simultaneously publishing evidence that reform has not occurred, is not consistent with that stated purpose. You do not raise $1 billion for an organization you are internally pressuring to reform, while an independent rights organization publicly states the reforms have not happened. Those two positions cannot coexist without one of them being an untrue. And if the board role was always primarily a platform role rather than a governance function, then the argument that Harry was driving reform from within was never the real story. None of that is a misquote, that is a documented contradiction. One of the most reliable ways to assess the strength of a public position is to look at who steps forward to defend it when it comes under pressure. Credentialed, informed people who know the facts from the inside, make choices about when to speak and when to stay silent. And those choices carry information. When Survival International published its May 2026 renewed resignation demand, a documented record of meaningful rebuttal is thin. African Parks issued a statement, but that statement carries the weight of an interested party, not an independent voice. Harry's representatives did not, as of the time of filming, issue a public statement engaging with Survival International's specific claims that the problems on the ground had not been resolved, and that silence on the substance of those allegations is itself a data point. Conservation professionals with standing in the field, people who have worked in central African parks, who understand the specific dynamics of the Odzala cocoa situation, who could speak to whether African parks reform commitments have actually changed conditions for the baka, have not stepped forward in significant numbers to publicly state that Survival International's account is wrong. The silence from that community carries weight because these are people who would hold both the knowledge and, in many cases, the professional incentive to defend an organization they believed was being unfairly characterized. The conservation community is not without voices. Those voices have not been loud in African Parks' defense on this specific issue. Journalists who cover indigenous rights in Central Africa, reporters who have been to the Republic of Congo, spoken to members of the Baka community, and reviewed the Omnia strategy findings, have not produced counter-reporting suggesting Survival International's concerns are misplaced. The absence of credible counter-reporting in a media environment that is not generally reluctant to push back on Survival International when the facts warrant it is meaningful. And then there is the Omnia strategy report itself. Cherie Blair's firm does not produce reports friendly to activists and hostile to institutions as a matter of ideology. Omnia Strategy is a commercial law firm whose clients include governments and major international organizations, which meant the firm had no inherent incentive to find what it found. African Parks commissioned that report, received those findings, and acknowledged them publicly. The people who could have said this didn't happen did not say it. The people who could have said it was resolved did not say it. The silence is the answer. Credibility collapses in the humanitarian space do not produce press releases. Organizations that decide to distance themselves from a figure rarely announce that they are doing so because of a credibility problem. They simply act. Deals get restructured. Invitations decline to renew. Funding gets redirected. Each decision read individually can be attributed to strategic priorities or budget constraints or market conditions, but read as a pattern, they tell a clear story. Consider what the institutional behavior around Harry's African Parks role has looked like since the documented evidence of abuse became public. The $1 billion fundraiser in Scottsdale is a complicated data point in that context. On one hand, the event suggests African Parks has not lost access to major donors yet. On the other hand, the fact that the fundraiser required Harry's prominent personal participation at a moment of active public controversy over the organization's human rights record suggests that the institution needed his visibility precisely because its independent credibility sat under pressure. An organization with an unimpeachable reputation raises money on the strength of its track record. An organization asking a celebrity board member to front $1 billion ask in Arizona is leaning on platform in a way that implies the platform is carrying work the institutional reputation can no longer carry alone. Governments matter here too. Conservation organizations operating under park management agreements depend on the continued goodwill of host governments, partner governments, and bilateral funders, and the conditions under which those relationships are maintained are sensitive to human rights findings. A named independent investigation finding rape and torture by park rangers, acknowledged publicly by the organization, changes the political calculus for any government official who has publicly endorsed that organization. Downstream effects of that recalculation are not announced. They are felt. The donor community is watching as well. Major philanthropic foundations, the kind that make 8-figure commitments to conservation organizations, carry human rights due diligence frameworks, and the 2025 acknowledgement and the 2026 Survival International statement together constitute a documented record that any serious foundation program officer is now required to assess before approving a grant. That assessment process slows giving even when it does not stop it, and the board member who attended a fundraiser 2 days after a formal resignation demand did not make that calculus easier for anyone trying to defend the relationship. This section requires the most precision because the comparison being drawn here is not about character. It is about structural position, and the structural difference between Harry and Meghan in the context of a credibility collapse is stark. Harry was born a prince. His name sits in the constitutional documents of the United Kingdom, and his position in the line of succession, 6th, as of the time of filming, exists independently of anything he says, does, or fails to do. His connection to British military history through his own service, his founding of the Invictus Games, his biography as a man who served in Afghanistan and lost his mother in front of the world, these are not contingent on a narrative. They are documented facts in the public record. Strip everything else away, and Harry remains the son of a king. The humanitarian identity is an addition to that foundation, not a replacement for it. If the African Park situation produces a serious, stained credibility problem for Harry's advocacy work, and the documented record suggests it should, he falls back on a floor that is deep and wide. He is still who he was born to be. Now consider the specific content of the credibility claim under examination. That Harry's post-royal identity as a humanitarian campaigner is genuine, consistent, and supported by his actual behavior when the cost of consistency is high. That claim says something specific, that this man, when his advocacy values conflict with institutional comfort, chooses his values. He left the royal family, he said, in part because he could no longer tolerate the gap between what the institution claimed to stand for and what it actually did. He made that argument publicly, repeatedly, across settings ranging from Oprah's sofa to his own memoir, and he built his post-royal identity on the claim that he would be accountable in ways the palace was not. The Baka people of the Republic of Congo are not a tabloid story. They are an indigenous community whose ancestral land was absorbed into a national park, whose members were beaten and raped by rangers paid by the organization Harry sits on the board of, and whose situation, per the rights organization that has been most carefully watching it, has not materially improved despite acknowledgments and commitments from that organization. The gap between Harry's stated values and his documented behavior in this specific situation is not a nuance. It is the specific test case his own rhetoric invites, and that is the one thing he cannot spin his way out of. Not because it destroys him, his floor exists, and it is real, but because the humanitarian identity has no floor of its own. It is constructed entirely from the credibility of the narrative, and the narrative just met a documented contradiction it cannot absorb without cost. The Baka people did not ask to be in this story. An indigenous forest community in the Republic of Congo, the Baka have lived in and around the Congo Basin forest for generations, and their relationship to the land that is now Odzala Kokua National Park is not a policy position. Hunting, gathering, ceremony, burial, memory. The park boundary did not erase that relationship. It criminalized it. The rangers whose job is to enforce the park boundary are the people who, according to the Omnia strategy investigation, beat, tortured, and raped members of that community. These are not statistics. These are people, and the cruelty of their position in this story is that they carry that mechanism to make themselves visible in the way that celebrity culture registers visibility. No press conferences, no tweets, no podcast appearances. Survival International's reports and the Omnia strategy findings and the academic literature on fortress conservation in Central Africa carry their presence in documents, but documents do not confer the kind of presence that moves the machinery of public attention. Harry, by contrast, commands more mechanisms for generating public attention than almost any private individual alive. His attendance at a fundraising event in Scottsdale, Arizona, generated news coverage that reached far more people than any Survival International press release, and the asymmetry is complete and not accidental. It is structural. None of that mattered because of a specific irony at the center of this story. The Baka's existence as a cause, their visibility in the English-language discourse about African conservation, depends partly on the attention that figures like Harry generate for the sector. African conservation as a funded priority exists in part because wealthy Western donors respond to the cultural framing that celebrity board members provide. The man whose participation helps generate the $1 billion that fund the rangers who hurt the Baka is also, by his presence, part of the system that generates the attention that makes the Baka's story occasionally visible to those same donors. They did not ask for any of this. They did not ask to be inside a national park, did not ask to become the human cost of a conservation model that Western donors fund because a British prince lends it his name. They just lived in a forest. Here is what the documented record shows. Survival International wrote to Harry in May 2023, citing his own stated values and asking him to resign from African Parks board over abuses against the Baka people. African Parks issued its own acknowledgement of those abuses in May 2025. Survival International published a renewed formal resignation demand in May 2026, stating that the problems had not been resolved. Harry attended a $1 billion fundraiser for African Parks in Scottsdale, Arizona on May 27 and 28, 2026. The origin story, that Harry's African conservation work is grounded in genuine, consistent humanitarian values, cannot survive the documented timeline. The legal position of a board member who continues fundraising after their own organization has acknowledged abuse, while a credentialed rights organization publicly states the abuse is ongoing, is complicated. The industry is watching. The donors are assessing. The governments that partner with African Parks are recalibrating, and the formal public statement from Harry's representatives engaging substantively with Survival International's specific claim that the problems on the ground have not been resolved. Silence where that statement should exist is the loudest statement in the record. African Parks acknowledged in 2025 that its rangers committed serious abuses against the Baka people. Survival International stated in May 2026 that those abuses are ongoing. Harry attended a fundraiser for African Parks in May 2026 to help raise $1 billion. That $1 billion raised in Scottsdale was raised for a specific purpose: the expansion of African Parks operations. More parks, more rangers, more park boundaries drawn through more ancestral lands, more enforcement. The investigation already confirmed abuse occurred. The rights group says it is still happening, and the organization's reform commitments have not, per Survival International's documented assessments, changed conditions on the ground. Leave your answer in the comments, because the Baka people, sitting in a forest in the Republic of Congo, will not be in Scottsdale to ask the question themselves. And I want to know who you think answers for where that $1 billion goes.